Before you were aware of it, before you named it, before you questioned it, there was already a pattern speaking to you. Every sunrise that broke the darkness, every closed door that redirected your steps, every moment you called coincidence was carrying a signature. Nothing stands alone, nothing is random. The world around you is not silent, it is speaking in symbols, echoes, and reminders. But the eyes see only what the mind has been trained to recognize. Many look at life and see chaos, delay, interruption. Yet others look at the same moments and discern purpose, alignment, and the nearness of the eternal. The difference is not circumstance, it is perception. To train your mind to see God in everything is to awaken from spiritual blindness. It is to realize that the ordinary is clothed with the divine, that the mundane hides mysteries, and that even what was meant to break you was permitted to shape you. When the mind is renewed, the world changes without changing. Suddenly, every breath becomes a message, every step a calling, every moment an invitation to see beyond the surface and into the hand that has been guiding you all along. There is a moment when a word is spoken from heaven and time itself begins to move differently, because when God speaks, days are no longer ordinary units of measure. They become vessels carrying purpose. And when a specific number is attached to a divine word, it is never accidental. It is a marker placed within history and within your life. For throughout the ages, the Eternal has revealed himself not only through what he does, but through when he does it. And the timing becomes part of the message, because delay is not denial and waiting is not absence. It is preparation. And when the word declares that something will happen in 3 days, it is announcing that a process has already begun, even if nothing yet appears to have changed. For the unseen always moves before the seen, and the invisible realm shifts long before the natural realm can register its effects, just as seeds break open underground, before a shoot ever touches the surface, and just as dawn is decided long before the sky begins to lighten. So the decree of 3 days signals that what is coming has already crossed a threshold, that the countdown has started not to inform God but to prepare you. Because heaven does not need reminders, but humanity does, and the mention of days anchors eternity into time, so that faith has something to hold on to, while sight still has nothing to show. And this is why the mind must be trained to understand divine timing, because the natural instinct is to measure progress by visible movement, yet God measures progress by alignment, by separation, by positioning, by what is being rearranged beneath the surface. And often the first day looks like nothing, the second day looks like resistance, and the third day looks like contradiction giving way to confirmation. Because divine timing often disguises itself as silence before it reveals itself as fulfillment, and those who do not understand this abandon the promise on the first day, question it on the second, and miss it entirely on the third. Not because the word failed, but because perception did. And the scriptures are filled with this rhythm, not as repetition, but as revelation, showing that God works in patterns so that those who watch closely can discern what season they are standing in. And when a season is numbered, it is not meant to create fear, but expectancy, not panic, but readiness. Because numbered days are not a threat. They are a sign of order. And order is the language of creation, for even the world itself was formed through measured days, light separated from darkness, waters divided, ground appearing, life emerging in stages, and humanity arriving last, not because it was least, but because everything else had to be prepared first. And in the same way, when God speaks of 3 days in your life, it is an echo of creation, a declaration that something is being formed, something is being separated, something is being made ready for emergence. And the reason it often feels uncomfortable is because formation always involves pressure, separation always involves loss, and preparation always involves waiting. And yet the mind trained by fear interprets waiting as abandonment, while the mind trained by faith recognizes waiting as evidence that the process is still active. Because if nothing were happening, there would be no countdown. And this is why the enemy of your soul works hardest in the space between the word and the fulfillment. Because if he cannot stop what God has spoken, he will try to distort how you perceive time, making hours feel heavier, days feel longer, and silence feel louder, so that impatience can do what opposition could not. And the greatest test of faith is not whether you believe God can do it, but whether you believe He is still doing it when you cannot see it. And divine timing often offends human logic because it refuses to rush for the sake of comfort and refuses to delay for the sake of fear. It moves according to purpose alone. And when the word says 3 days, it is not giving you a deadline to worry about, but a window to prepare your heart, to align your thoughts, to separate from what cannot go where you are going, because what emerges on the third day cannot coexist with everything that surrounded you on the first. And this is why the waiting feels like stripping, like pruning, like quiet removal, because timing is not just about when something appears, but about what must disappear before it does. And many pray for sudden change without realizing that sudden outcomes still require hidden processes. And those processes take place within time, even when they are governed by eternity. And the reason God marks time in these moments is because humans live within it, and without markers, faith would drift, hope would weaken, and expectation would dissolve into uncertainty. So the numbered days become anchors, reminders that history is not random and neither is your life, that moments are not floating aimlessly, but moving toward appointed outcomes, and that the God who stands outside of time chooses to step into it when He wants you to recognize His hand. And 3 days is never just 3 days. It is the space between declaration and demonstration, between promise and proof, between the word spoken and the word manifested, and the mind trained to see God, and everything begins to recognize that even the waiting is sacred, even the silence is intentional, even the delay is directional. Because divine timing does not waste moments, it redeems them, shaping the vessel while preparing the outcome, aligning the heart while arranging the circumstances. And when the third day arrives, it rarely looks the way the mind imagined on the first. Because God is not committed to fulfilling expectations. He is committed to fulfilling purpose, and purpose often exceeds expectation while contradicting assumption. And this is why those who survive the waiting emerge transformed, because time has done its work within them, breaking old patterns, weakening old dependencies, sharpening discernment, strengthening trust, so that when the fulfillment comes, it does not crush them, but crowns them. Because timing is not only about receiving something new, but about becoming someone new. And this is the hidden message embedded within the countdown, that what God is about to do around you is inseparable from what He is doing within you. And the 3 days are not merely passing on a calendar, but unfolding within the soul, aligning heaven and earth, word and reality, promise and person, until the moment arrives when what was spoken can finally stand revealed in the natural realm from the beginning. The third day has never been an ordinary day. It has always been a threshold, a turning point, a moment where what seemed finished reveals that it was only waiting. Because in the language of God, the third day is the day where endings are reversed and silence gives way to revelation. And this is why the mention of 3 days carries weight beyond numbers. It carries memory, prophecy, and pattern. For throughout sacred history, the third day marks the moment when heaven interrupts the narrative humanity assumed was over. When what appeared buried begins to stir, when what looked delayed reveals itself as appointed. Because the third day is not about speed, but about certainty, not about haste, but about fulfillment. And this is why fear often intensifies as the third day approaches. Because darkness understands the pattern even when people forget it. And it knows that what survives 2 days of pressure is positioned for emergence on the third. And this is why the mind must be trained to recognize the significance of this timing. Because without understanding the pattern, the soul misreads the process, interpreting the second day as failure instead of transition, and the silence as absence instead of anticipation. Yet the third day has always been the day when God reveals that He was present even when unseen, active even when quiet, moving even when still. And this pattern repeats not to limit God, but to teach humanity how He works. Because repetition is not redundancy, it is instruction. And the third day teaches that God allows a full cycle of human emotion to pass before He intervenes. The shock of the first day, the doubt of the second, the surrender that often comes just before the third, because surrender creates space, and space invites revelation. And this is why the third day often arrives after hope has been thinned but not extinguished, because pure faith does not demand signs, it waits for them. And the third day is the sign that waiting was not wasted, that endurance was not in vain, that trust was not misplaced. And when God speaks of 3 days, He is not creating suspense for drama. He is completing a pattern that ensures transformation rather than mere relief. Because immediate rescue might remove pain, but delayed revelation reshapes perception. And God is always more concerned with who you become than with what you escape. And the third day accomplishes this by stretching the space between promise and proof just enough to detach the heart from control. Because control resists resurrection, and only surrender can witness it. And this is why the third day often comes when plans have ended, strength has faded, and explanations have run out. Because resurrection does not negotiate with human logic, it overrides it, and the mind trained to see God in everything begins to recognize that the third day is not a coincidence but a confirmation, not a delay but a declaration that the process has reached fullness, that what needed to die has died, that what needed to be separated has been separated, that what needed to be stripped has been stripped, so that what emerges carries no residue of the old season. And this is why the third day is feared by darkness and misunderstood by the impatient, because it belongs to those who stayed, who waited, who endured the quiet without rewriting the promise. And many miss the power of the third day, because they interpret the first two as evidence against the word, when in truth they are evidence that the word is unfolding exactly as it should, because divine patterns do not bend to emotional timelines, they unfold according to eternal wisdom. And the third day is the moment when eternity intersects time visibly, when heaven answers earth not with explanation, but with manifestation. And this is why the third day often changes not only circumstances but testimony. Because after it you no longer speak of what you believe God will do, you speak of what He has done. And the mind trained by fear looks for relief, but the mind trained by faith looks for meaning, and meaning is revealed on the third day. Because meaning requires process, and process requires time, and time reveals truth, and the third day is truth unveiled, the declaration that God was never late, never absent, never uncertain, but precise, intentional, and faithful, moving according to a rhythm established long before you entered the situation. And this is why when God says something will happen in 3 days, He is not guessing. He is signaling alignment, that unseen preparations have reached completion, that resistance has served its purpose, that waiting has matured faith, and that what is about to emerge carries the signature of heaven, not because it arrived quickly, but because it arrived rightly. And the third day does not simply restore what was lost. It redefines what is possible, because resurrection always exceeds restoration, and revelation always surpasses expectation. And those who understand this no longer fear the waiting, because they recognize the pattern, they see the markers, they discern the season, and they know that when the third day arrives, it will not ask permission from circumstances, it will not consult the past, it will not negotiate with doubt, it will simply reveal what God has already decided, bringing into the open what was being formed in secret, turning mourning into witness, silence into declaration, and waiting into fulfillment. Between the moment a word is spoken and the moment it comes to pass, there exists a sacred tension, a space that most people rush through without understanding. Yet this space is where the deepest work takes place, because God does not simply release outcomes, He releases processes, and the space between promise and fulfillment is not empty. It is active, shaping, testing, aligning, revealing, and the mind that is not trained will misinterpret this interval as delay, while the mind that is awakened will recognize it as preparation. For what God declares instantly in the Spirit often unfolds gradually in the natural, not because He lacks power, but because humanity requires transformation. And this is why the time between the word and its manifestation often feels heavier than the moment of waiting, before the word was ever spoken. Because once a promise is given, expectation is activated, and expectation exposes impatience, fear, control, and doubt that were previously hidden beneath routine. And God allows this exposure not to condemn, but to cleanse. Because what surfaces in the waiting is what must be addressed before the fulfillment arrives. And this is why many people love prophetic words but struggle with prophetic processes, because the word excites but the process confronts. And what happens in this space determines whether the fulfillment becomes a blessing or a burden. Because a promise received too early can crush the one who prayed for it. And this is why God often withholds manifestation until alignment is complete. Because alignment protects both the gift and the recipient. And in this space, God works quietly, removing dependencies, breaking old patterns of thinking, severing emotional attachments, and reshaping desires so that when the promise arrives, it does not become an idol. And the silence in this interval is not absence. It is concealment, because God often hides his work until it is strong enough to stand without explanation. And the greatest mistake made in this season is assuming that because nothing is visible, nothing is happening. Yet visibility has never been the measure of divine activity. For the most powerful transformations occur underground, unseen, unheard, and uncelebrated. And the waiting exposes where trust truly resides. Because when there is nothing to point to except the word itself, faith is purified from performance. And belief becomes a choice rather than a reaction. And this is why the enemy targets this space so aggressively. Because if he can distort your perception of the process, he can convince you to abandon the promise voluntarily. And many walk away not because God failed, but because waiting redefined their expectations. And in this space, the mind must be retrained to see God in the mundane, in the repetition of days, in the quiet obedience, in the small adjustments. Because the extraordinary is built through ordinary faithfulness. And God uses this interval to teach discernment, to sharpen spiritual senses, so that you can recognize his movement, even when circumstances appear unchanged. And the waiting becomes a classroom where patience is taught, endurance is strengthened, humility is cultivated, and dependency is transferred from outcomes to presence. Because God's ultimate goal is not to prove his power, but to form relationship, and relationship deepens in the absence of constant reassurance. And this is why the waiting often strips away alternatives, because as long as there are other options, trust is divided. And divided trust cannot carry full revelation. And the process continues until the heart reaches a place where it no longer needs to control the outcome to believe the word. And this surrender marks a turning point, because surrender signals readiness, and readiness invites release. And the moment the heart aligns with the promise without conditions, the process begins to conclude, not because time has run out, but because alignment has been achieved. And many do not realize that the waiting would end sooner if resistance ended sooner. Because God does not delay unnecessarily, he delays intentionally, and intention always serves transformation. And this is why the interval between the word and fulfillment often looks different for different people, because the work required is different. And comparison in this season becomes dangerous because it shifts focus from obedience to outcome, and outcome-focused faith grows restless, while obedience-focused faith grows resilient, and resilience is required to carry what is coming. Because what God fulfills often draws attention, responsibility, and opposition, and without the refining of the waiting, the fulfillment would overwhelm rather than elevate. And this is why those who survive the process emerge with depth, discernment, and authority, because authority is not granted at the moment of fulfillment, but forged in the waiting. And when the manifestation finally appears, it is not merely a result. It is a witness, testifying that the word was true, the process was purposeful, and the waiting was necessary. And the mind trained through this space no longer fears delays, because it has learned that God is just as present in the process as he is in the promise, just as active in the waiting as he is in the fulfillment. And this awareness transforms impatience into expectancy, frustration into trust, and silence into assurance. Because the space between the word and its fulfillment is not a void to be endured, but a passage to be understood, a sacred corridor where heaven reshapes earth by reshaping the human heart before anything new is revealed. Something old must be removed, because God never adds without first separating. And this is the part of the process that is least understood and most resisted, because separation feels like loss even when it is protection, and feels like rejection even when it is redirection. Yet throughout divine history, separation has always preceded manifestation, because what God is about to bring forth cannot coexist with everything that surrounded the previous season. And this is why when the word is spoken and the countdown begins, relationships begin to change, environments begin to shift, familiar supports begin to weaken, and comforts once relied upon begin to fade, not as punishment but as preparation. Because the new thing requires space, and space is created through separation, and the mind that is not trained interprets this as abandonment, while the awakened mind discerns that God is clearing ground, because what is about to emerge must stand on consecrated soil, and consecration always involves distinction, the setting apart of what belongs to the next season from what belonged to the last, and this separation is often subtle at first, a quiet distancing, a growing discomfort, a loss of peace in places that once felt safe. Because God does not always announce separation with dramatic signs, He often allows restlessness to become the signal. And those who listen recognize that restlessness is not dissatisfaction but discernment, revealing that alignment has shifted. And this is why resistance increases in this phase, because separation threatens familiarity, and familiarity provides a false sense of security even when it no longer serves purpose. And the heart must be trained to value calling over comfort, because comfort resists change, and change is required for manifestation. And the separation before fulfillment is not random, it is precise, removing only what cannot go where God is leading. Yet because attachment clouds discernment, it often feels like everything is being taken, when in truth only what would hinder the next phase is being removed. And this is why the separation often targets identity before circumstances, stripping labels, roles, and expectations that were formed in previous seasons. Because if identity remains rooted in the old, the new will feel foreign, and God desires continuity of purpose even through transformation of form. And this is why isolation sometimes accompanies separation, because noise interferes with clarity, and clarity is required to recognize what is unfolding. And isolation is not abandonment when it is orchestrated by God. It is alignment, a narrowing of focus, so that distraction does not dilute obedience. And many fear this stage because it exposes the soul, removing external affirmations and familiar validations. Yet exposure is necessary, because what is hidden cannot be healed, and what is unhealed cannot be trusted with revelation. And the separation also serves another purpose. It protects what is coming from premature exposure, because not everyone who was present in the preparation is permitted to witness the manifestation. And this is why some people leave before the breakthrough, not because they were unimportant, but because their assignment was seasonal. And misunderstanding this leads to bitterness, yet discernment leads to peace, because peace comes from recognizing that God removes people not to punish them or you, but to preserve alignment. And this separation intensifies as the appointed moment approaches, because proximity to fulfillment requires greater purity of focus. And distractions that were once tolerated become unbearable, and compromises that once seemed harmless become heavy. And this discomfort is the signal that the transition is nearing, because manifestation cannot occur in a divided state, and division delays revelation. And this is why the enemy often disguises separation as failure, whispering that loss means the word was false, when in truth loss often means the word is close, because what is about to appear requires you to stand alone with God, without leaning on substitutes, without negotiating obedience, without diluting faith. And the mind trained to see God in everything begins to recognize separation as confirmation rather than contradiction, understanding that God never removes without intention, never separates without purpose, never strips without restoring, and what feels like subtraction is actually precision, because God is refining the vessel so that when the manifestation arrives, it is not contaminated by the residue of former seasons. And the separation also reveals loyalty, because only those aligned with purpose can remain through transition. And this revelation is painful but necessary, because clarity prevents confusion when the outcome appears. And this is why the final stage before manifestation often feels the loneliest, because alignment narrows before expansion, and the path constricts before it opens. And those who endure this stage emerge with clarity, authority, and discernment, because they have learned to stand without support other than the Word itself. And this posture is required to carry what God is about to reveal, because manifestation without separation produces compromise, but manifestation after separation produces consecration, and consecration invites permanence, and permanence distinguishes divine outcomes from temporary victories. Because what God establishes through separation is not easily shaken, not easily imitated, not easily reversed, as it carries the weight of alignment, obedience, and surrendered trust. And this is why separation is not the enemy of fulfillment, but its gateway. The narrow passage that leads to revelation, the pruning that precedes fruit, the silence that precedes declaration, and those who understand this no longer fear what is falling away, because they recognize that what remains is what is required for what is about to happen.